I recognize that having me step in for Lester Snow has to qualify as the greatest bait and switch in the history of water conferences. As I was reflecting on that on the way over here, it reminded me of a story that some of you may have heard about the Nobel laureate, who I won't name, who after winning his Nobel Prize went on a speaking tour to share his research with the world. After a few months of this, he one day realized that he needed a break, so he said to his chauffeur, "I don't want to do this tonight. You give my talk." The chauffeur, being a thoughtful person, said, "Okay, I've been sitting in the back of the room for the last few months. I'll give it a go." And he got up that evening and he nailed it. Gave it perfect presentation. And then comes a question and answer period. Distinguished professor gets up and gives a 8-part dissection of a sub-element of the Nobel Prize winning theorem. Our hero looks him straight in the eye and says, "Sir, that is a stupid question." In fact, it is such a stupid question that I'm going to get my chauffeur sitting back there to answer it for me. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. I was originally invited to, or asked to give an overview of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, lovingly referred to here in California as SGMA, with some of its implications for California's groundwater. I was disturbed to note that Undersecretary Burns gave the talk for me, as did Trevor Joseph, and then a string of other people in the SGMA session. So I ran back to the drawing board and rewrote it quickly. So we'll see what comes out here. Many of you here in the room are literally living the answers to some of the questions that I'll pose in my remarks today. You're doing that by contributing to the law's implementation. Many others have come great distances and bring perspective from groundwater basins throughout the country and the world. So because we have a diversity of audience here, I'll try to cover a fair amount of ground. But basically, I'd like to talk about 3 things. I will briefly sketch some of the features of SGMA, recognizing that these earlier speakers have done a better and maybe more thorough job of doing so. But it's a lot to absorb if you're hearing this stuff for the first time. I'll then dive into what I think is the more juicy stuff, and namely some of the unanswered questions that are left by the law and the nature of how it approaches its goal of achieving sustainable groundwater management for the state. And I'll end with a little bit of a discussion of a favorite topic of mine, namely innovation, and argue that balancing some of the uncertainties that are left by the statute itself is the potential for the law to actively encourage new approaches to groundwater management. So, what is SGMA? As I said, I'll gloss the details and just give the essential context. The nutshell here is that SGMA is a major and potentially revolutionary change in California law. SGMA adopts a state policy of managing groundwater resources sustainably. The law defines sustainability as the avoidance of 6 undesirable results. These undesirable results are the significant and unreasonable lowering of groundwater levels, reductions in groundwater storage, water quality impacts, saltwater intrusion, subsidence, and impacts to interconnected surface waters. Significant and unreasonable. For my part, I think that this is quite an impressive list. It's a forward-thinking list, and in concept, what it does that not all groundwater laws do is it pushes the goals of the law towards the things that we care about more directly. That is, towards the impacts of this unsustainable groundwater use and how to address them, as opposed to by any particular proxy. To accomplish these objectives, Sigma relies explicitly on the notion of local control with a state backstop. Now, local control. The law gives central importance to the work of new local entities called groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs. Now, I don't know if it's only in California that water comes in an alphabet soup, but I'll only ask you to remember 3 acronyms. You already got Sigma. Now, groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, and GSAs will do much of the work of implementing Sigma by developing, implementing, and updating groundwater sustainability plans, which are GSPs. So 3 acronyms, that's all. Now, Sigma needs to do this on a fairly rapid timeline, but it's a major step forward for California groundwater, and it has the potential to be revolutionary for California natural resources management more broadly, including for land use, and all of this is going to have profound impacts on the state's agriculture. However, the law does leave some unanswered questions. The devil is in the details here, and implementation of the law will be fraught with peril. We won't know if and where it succeeds for some time. So I'd like to look forward a little bit to some of the unknowns in hopes that it'll help us better understand what Sigma does and doesn't do, and look forward to ultimately answering some of these questions as we go forward. So I'll mention just 5 of the things that have been on my mind in this regard lately. Some of them actually stem directly from the very things that make the law distinctive in the first place. So the overall message here is that Sigma is unprecedented, it's hugely impactful, and a work in progress. The first unknown, and I mentioned this first because we've published a report recently that I'm happy to share copies with anybody here, is how GSAs will decide on their governance structure and their institutional design. These decisions are being made now, so attention to this is important, but thinking forward about the implications is simultaneously very important. In our report, we developed a framework with 9 criteria that we argue are important for GSAs to consider in developing governance that's both fair and effective. Now, I'll mention just a few of them, and again, refer you to this for more details, but some of the themes are woven throughout my remarks. First, scale is a crucial element. Ideally, the jurisdiction of an agency would match that of the resource that's being managed. Now, recognizing that this is not always possible or even desirable to do, it does seem to be happening in at least a few basins. However, in others, there are signs that the patchwork quilt model is going to be what emerges. And that is understandable given the institutional stratigraphy that we have here in California. But it's this diversity of the formation of the GSAs themselves that will form some natural experiment, perhaps, that we can see how the outcomes of these different approaches work out in the end. But what's at stake is transaction costs for coordination, or ultimately even the effectiveness of a GSA or a set of GSAs at being able to manage a basin in all its complexity. A second criterion from our report is capacity. The best plans are not going to be worth the paper they're printed on without an agency that has the ability to actually implement them. Funding, technical ability, legal expertise, management, and so forth They're all non-trivial to acquire, particularly for new entities, and I would argue that it's essential that GSAs be capable of all of these things to handle the difficult tasks that face them. In all of this, broad and meaningful participation and representation are essential if GSAs are to develop programs that are effective and represent the range of interests who are affected by their actions. Now, we'll hear a lot about this in the governance track on Thursday, so I'm really looking forward to some of the talks there as well. Now, there are other elements in the framework, and again, I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm happy to share this piece with you with anyone who's interested. So that's the first unknown. The others are briefer, I promise. The second unknown is how will the sustainability goals of GSAs actually be operationalized? And in particular, how will they be translated, where necessary, into limitations on groundwater pumping? In many of the 127 groundwater basins affected by SGMA, the status quo is simply unsustainable. That applies to the amounts and patterns of groundwater use will need to change. Now, this can happen in several ways. Groundwater users can reduce the amount of water in order to spare the resource and reduce their water use. Groundwater users can seek to replace some or all of their water uses with new supplies, such as, for example, imported surface water. Or groundwater users can find ways to recharge their aquifers, including through creative use of resources such as stormwater, peak flood flows, recycled water, and so forth. We don't know what the mix of these approaches will end up being in any particular area, though it will certainly be location-specific and opportunistic, as reflects the flexibility in the law. But more importantly, we don't know how a cap on groundwater use will be determined, allocated, and updated. Those are the difficult decisions that some of us in the room ultimately will face. Now, for those of us who think in terms of safe yield, note that SGMA is slightly different here. Sustainable yield under the law is not defined physically by the law. Rather, it's defined by the avoidance of these 6 undesirable results. Now, those undesirable results are locally specific and themselves depend on the operationalization of the act. The GSAs will determine what the undesirable results are and how they need to go about avoiding them. So there's a little bit of circularity here, and getting it right will require some careful analysis and difficult decisions, and perhaps some iteration. So third unknown involves the interaction between groundwater and surface water. One of the most promising and potentially most fraught aspects of SGMA is that it specifically and also implicitly calls out interactions between groundwater and surface water. From an ecological perspective, the notion of formally recognizing groundwater-dependent ecosystems is an important and, again, forward-thinking element of the law. The challenge will be how to make decisions that are technically sound and ecologically meaningful while balancing the potential tensions this may create. Now, I expect that Sandy Matsumoto and others will discuss various elements of this tension in their remarks in the conference, and look forward to those talks as well. Groundwater-surface water interactions also relates very closely to my fourth unknown, which is the role of markets. SGMA will fundamentally affect the economics of groundwater. In essence, SGMA will become a new driver of scarcity for water in the basins. Now, the perceived need for markets as a potential solution is implicit in the sense that many groundwater users and the local entities that are forming GSAs are expecting to augment their water supplies by buying water from within their basins or outside them. In fact, many existing districts, as we heard in sessions yesterday, already do this to some extent. Sigma explicitly enables market mechanisms like water transfers as one potential tool for helping to achieve sustainability. But again, it does not provide specific guidelines as to how GSAs should or can go about implementing markets. Now, I would argue that markets can be excellent tools for achieving efficiency. However, markets are also extraordinarily good at creating externalities and inequity. Both of these are things that not only we care about in California, but have some protections under the law. So addressing these concerns implies very careful and non-obvious efforts in market design where and if markets are to be employed. There are also fundamental legal questions about the transferability of some kinds of groundwater rights. These don't seem to have come to the fore yet, but maybe we'll expect to see those in the not too distant future. Ultimately, whether and how GSAs can design effective and fair markets as part of their efforts to achieve sustainability will be quite fascinating to observe. Okay. The fifth unknown is, what does significant and unreasonable actually mean? Recall that at the core of Sigma is preventing undesirable results, and these undesirable results are not unambiguously defined in the law or in the regulations that DWR has recently published. The implication is that GSAs will themselves define, through the development of their GSPs, what they think significant and unreasonable impacts are. At least they'll do this implicitly based on the thresholds and measurable objectives that they choose to adopt and manage for. Now, contrast this to other regulatory programs, for example, the Clean Water Act, where the US Environmental Protection Agency or state implementing agencies generate numeric targets for water quality goals based variously on studies of water quality impacts or the ability of available technology to actually deliver reductions. Now, this is not perfect in practice, but it does reduce the ambiguity. For Sigma, navigating the values-based choices that will inevitably arise in implementing the law, and doing so in defensible ways, forms, in my view, really the heart of the challenges that will be faced down the road. So ultimately, where there's conflict, the courts may need to decide, but when they do so, they may do so with the nuance of a butcher knife, where a scalpel would be more appropriate and more effective. Thankfully, we are blessed with quite a scalpel here in California. We have an active research community, many of you are here today, that's trying to get out in front of many of these questions and helping to provide information that's salient, credible, and legitimate to those who have the really hard job of actually making the decisions and doing this hard work to address these challenges. Okay. I realize that my list may seem a little gloomy, but it's not intended that way. I want to be clear that these are unanswered questions, but they're not unanswerable questions. This is all very exciting stuff. Sigma is a grand experiment. Groundwater management has never been done before in just this way. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to observe, to learn from, and hopefully for many of you to contribute to. So to transition to a more explicitly positive note, one other thing that Sigma is doing is providing incentives that will, and already are, spur innovation in our water sector. In some previous work on innovation that I and my colleagues have conducted, we've argued that it's not necessarily the technological challenges that gate progress to innovation. That is, innovation is about more than just making a new widget. In particular, it's the institutional hurdles that provide challenges for the adoption and diffusion of new technologies into the broader practice that distinguishes a new invention or an idea from a truly game-changing innovation. Now, it's exciting to see that there are already many new ideas emerging as potential innovations, and I'll mention two of these potential innovations that are getting some discussion at our meeting this week. The first, on-farm recharge using winter flood flows. In the same way that Steve Jobs assembled existing microprocessor, battery, and display technologies to create something new with the iPhone, Helen Dalkey and her colleagues are putting two underutilized resources together to create something new. Here, the existing resources are the irrigation infrastructure and its unused infiltration capacity during the winter, and peak flood flows, which are similarly available in some cases, and similarly potentially underutilized. Spurred by the increasing awareness of the need for recharge in the wake of Sigma, this idea has huge potential, though of course scientific and institutional questions remain in a broad suite of areas. So I will certainly be attending talks by Helen and the others on this topic, and I hope that you will too. A second emerging potential innovation is recharge net metering. Now, innovation rarely happens in a vacuum. The notion of a eureka moment where something is created from scratch in the laboratory is very romantic, but a more common pathway for innovation is borrowing ideas, including ideas from other sectors, and repurposing them. For example, in the electricity sector, photovoltaic net metering makes it economically feasible for me to have solar panels on the roof of my house. This is because I'm connected to the electricity grid, so I can, in essence, sell electricity to the utility while the sun is shining brightly, and I'm down here, so I can't use it. But when I get home in the evening, I can buy back electricity from the utility from a different source. The net of these two flows is what determines ultimately my annual electricity bill. Recharge net metering borrows from this concept. In the Pajaro Valley, an hour south of here, Andy Fisher is working with local groundwater agency to develop an analogous scheme. Landowners who invest in projects to recharge stormwater are credited against the augmentation fees that they otherwise pay, or that they pay for extracting water for use on their land. Now, what's exciting to me about the scheme is how it could align the interests of neighbors in the broader health of the aquifer. And what's really interesting about it is, if you think about it, how different the context and incentives are from more common methods like groundwater banking. Now, I hope that Brian Lockwood and Andy Fisher will mention a little bit about this, at least in their talks over the next couple days. But if not, I suggest that you corner them and ask them about it, because it's really fascinating. Now, again, it's important to note that there are a host of barriers to the diffusion of both of these examples, and they include water quality concerns, logistical and economic concerns, legal and financing ones, the usual suite. But they're both such sexy ideas. They're both getting so much interest and traction that I felt it worth mentioning to illustrate the broader point of how Sigma is forcing and enabling creative thinking by people like you. So here's what I hope that you will take away from all this. We have a law that is astounding for its potential to move California from a national laggard in groundwater to a position of national leadership and even international inspiration. But the very features of this law that enabled it to come into being and that make it so forward-looking produce uncertainties in its implementation that will be crucial to making it succeed in practice. There is one thing that we can place some hope on here in the land of Google, Apple, and Tesla, and that's that Sigma will continue to spur innovation that will change the conversation here in California, in part by learning from all of you, and ultimately in ways that we hope some of you someday will learn from and take to other parts of the country and to the world. Thank you very much for your kind attention.